Breaking news. Canada just doubled down on the China deal. And this is not some symbolic diplomatic gesture. This is not Ottawa sending a message for headlines and hoping Washington calms down. Before we continue, let's take a flashback.
Well, Prime Minister Mark Carney came to China with one key objective, and that was to get rid of punishing tariffs on Canadian canola. Canadian canola producers have been paying tariffs 75 to 100% depending on the product, and those tariffs are coming down now to 15% starting on March the 1st. And it's not just canola, there are other Canadian agricultural and agri-food products where we will also see Chinese tariffs drop. Think about lobster, think about some other seafood products. So that's good news. Agricultural products that have been facing steep tariffs, they will be coming off. Now the quid pro quo in that is that China wanted to sell more electric vehicles into the Canadian market. The Canadian market is not going to be wide open to Chinese EVs, but the Carney government has agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles to be exported to Canada,
Now, this is implementation. The tariffs are changing, the market access is opening. And Donald Trump's 100% tariff threat is not stopping it. If anything, it may have helped prove Carney's point. Now let's get clear on what just happened, because the details matter here. Back in January, Mark Carney went to Beijing and announced a major reset in Canada-China trade relations. The centerpieces were twofold. First, Canada agreed to open a quota channel for up to 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles per year at normal 6.1% most favored nation tariff rate, instead of keeping the 100% tariff wall imposed in 2024. Second, China agreed to lower or suspend tariffs on major Canadian exports, especially in agriculture and seafood. The January framework pointed to sharp relief on canola and other products. Then the February follow-through made it concrete. China announced it would suspend the 100% tariffs on canola meal and peas, and the 25% tariffs on lobster and crab, from March 1st through the end of 2026. Then, a day later, China issued its final canola ruling, cutting the anti-dumping duty to 5.9%, which, together with the standard 9% import tariff, brings the total duty to 14.9% for 5 years starting March 1st. So this is no longer hypothetical. March 1st changed the story. Because once tariff relief moves from speeches to published implementation dates, it stops being a diplomatic signal and starts becoming economic fact. And that is exactly why Washington reacted so aggressively. In late January, Trump threatened Canada with a 100% tariff if the China deal went through, saying Canada would become a drop-off point for Chinese products aimed at the US market. That was the pressure play. The idea was simple: to scare Ottawa, scare investors, scare Canadian exporters, and force Carney to retreat before the framework hardened into reality. But here is where the trade-economics lens matters. Tariff threats only work cleanly when the other side believes it has no alternative. That is the whole mechanism. If your economy is structurally trapped, then pressure produces compliance. If your economy is building options, then pressure can produce acceleration instead. And that is what makes this moment so important. For decades, Canada's basic economic problem has been overdependence on the United States. Roughly 70% to 75% of Canadian exports have historically gone south. That dependence gives Washington leverage, whether exercised quietly through standards and supply chain dominance, or loudly through tariff threats. Carney's broader strategy has been to reduce that vulnerability over time by building a trading order less reliant on the US. Reuters reported that explicitly in January. Now, let's be careful here. This does not mean Canada has escaped US dependence. It has not. The United States is still Canada's central market. The supply chains are still deeply integrated. Autos, energy, manufacturing, metals, and agriculture all still run through a North American architecture built over decades. But that is exactly why this deal matters. Because Ottawa is not trying to replace the US overnight. It is trying to reduce the cost of being threatened by the US. That is a different objective. And if you understand it, then the China deal makes much more sense. This is not Canada choosing China over America. This is Canada choosing optionality over single-point vulnerability. And the sectors tell the story. For Canadian farmers and exporters, the Chinese follow-through is immediate. Canola meal, peas, lobster, crab, and canola seed under a much lower final duty structure. Those are not abstract trade categories. Those are real export channels for real producers who have spent years dealing with tariff shocks and geopolitical whiplash. For Canada's EV market, the effect is different but equally strategic. By allowing a quota of Chinese-made EVs at 6.1%, Canada is not just tweaking trade. It is changing competitive pressure inside North America. It is saying that consumers should have access to cheaper EVs and that industrial strategy cannot be built only around shielding legacy producers behind tariff walls. Reuters' January reporting on the deal also showed how controversial this was, especially because it signaled a clear break from the 2024 Trudeau line. And this is where Trump's threat starts to look less like strength and more like a policy trap. Because if you threaten 100% tariffs and the other side still implements the deal, then one of two things happens. Either you follow through, and risk blowing up integrated North American supply chains in ways that hurt your own firms and consumers. Or you do not follow through, and the threat loses credibility. That is the dilemma. And right now, Washington has a second problem on top of that. Its tariff toolkit is under legal stress. After the US Supreme Court knocked out much of Trump's earlier emergency tariff architecture, the administration has been trying to rebuild leverage through new Section 301 investigations and other trade law pathways. Reuters reported this week that the US opened fresh unfair trade probes partly to rebuild tariff pressure after the Supreme Court decision. That matters because it shows Washington is not abandoning coercive trade policy. It is trying to reassemble it through more legally durable channels. So put those two developments together. On one side, Canada is turning a China reset into implemented market access. On the other side, Washington is still scrambling to rebuild tariff leverage after the courts weakened part of its old approach. That is why this is bigger than one bilateral spat. This is a contest over whether US pressure still produces automatic compliance inside North America. And the answer, right now, looks much more uncertain than Washington expected. Now, does this mean Canada is suddenly winning everything? No. That would be too simple. Because the risks are real. If Trump escalates anyway, Canada can still be hurt badly. The US market is still too large, too close, and too integrated to ignore. Canada's labor market and industrial base are still exposed to any serious US trade offensive. And US pressure may increasingly move away from emergency tariffs and toward the next USMCA, CUSMA review itself. Reuters reported just days ago that Canadian and Mexican officials are already emphasizing the importance of preserving the trilateral framework ahead of that review, while the US launches new trade investigations to regain leverage. That is the next battlefield. Not just tariffs at the border, but rules inside the treaty. Rules of origin, North American content, China exposure, industrial policy alignment, supply chain discipline. So when people ask whether Trump's 100% tariff threat backfired, the strongest answer is this. Yes, in the sense that it did not stop the deal. Yes, in the sense that it strengthened the political case inside Canada for diversification. Yes, in the sense that pressure is now producing more strategic hedging, not less. But also no, if by backfire, you mean the US has lost all leverage. It hasn't, it is adapting, it is rebuilding. And it may try to shift the pressure from blunt tariff threats to the USMCA review and narrower trade law instruments. That is why the deeper story here is sovereignty. Not sovereignty in a romantic slogan sense. Sovereignty in the hard trade sense. Who can force whom to change course? Who has alternatives? Who can absorb pressure longer? Who gets to write the rules of access? What Carney is doing is trying to make Canada harder to coerce. Not independent from the United States in some fantasy sense, but less easy to bully. That is a serious shift. Because for a long time, the North American assumption was simple. Canada had nowhere else to go. This China deal does not erase geography, but it does weaken that assumption. And once that assumption weakens, bargaining changes. That is why Washington is rattled. Not because Canada has replaced the US, but because Canada is proving that even partial alternatives can change the psychology of power. And psychology matters in trade politics. Because the strongest tariff is often not the one that gets imposed. It is the one the other side is too afraid to test. Carney tested this one, and instead of retreating, he doubled down. That may turn out to be one of the most important North American trade signals of 2026. Because if pressure keeps producing alternatives, then the old US model of economic dominance inside its own neighborhood starts to look less automatic than it once did. And when that happens, everyone else starts taking notes too. So here is the real question. Did Trump's 100% tariff threat stop Canada from moving toward China? No. Did it make Canada more cautious? Not enough to halt implementation. Did it make the strategic logic of diversification more compelling inside Canada? Absolutely. And that is why this story matters. Not because one deal solves everything, but because one deal, implemented under threat, can expose how much leverage still works, and how much no longer works the way it used to.